think we can go ahead and get started. Appreciate y'all coming. My name is Matt Hubert. I'm the Development Services Director and Town Engineer for the Town of Waxhaw, and appreciate y'all coming out tonight. Basically, we're hosting this information session on behalf of the CRTPO, the Charlotte Regional Transportation Organization, to kind of set all the facts and the history and kind of set where we are now and where we want to go with planning this project. As a town engineer, I'm the town's primary technical contact for realizing the parkway we likely all realize we need, especially now that NC-16 widening is planned for scheduled construction by 2023-2024. So the purpose tonight is to explain at a high level the parkway planning history, the upcoming process to secure funding, and engage the ultimate design and construction of the project. So this is a collaborative effort between the Town of Waxhaw, the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization, or CRTPO, NCDOT, and Union County to provide a brief history of the Parkway's planning efforts and review the formal funding process. Other guests we have tonight are Neil Burke, the planning coordinator for CRTPO. Aaron Kinney is his principal planner. Stuart Basham, NCDOT's planning engineer for Division 10. And Bjorn Hansen with Union County Transportation Planning. So I'll present the project history, and then we can take a few minutes to take some questions. And then Neil will present the funding side of it, and we'll take some more questions at that point as well. There is a sign-in sheet. Hopefully everybody signs in so we can keep track of you, and comment sheets. And there will be a time to take comments online at the crtpo.org is where you can go ahead and do that. We are videoing tonight's session so it can be available online for anybody who's not here. If you can't recollect what's going on, we'll be able to pull this up at all times. So the concept of the parkway really dates all the way back to 1998. This is just a portion of the 2004 Mecklenburg Union Metropolitan Planning Organization Thoroughfare Plan. This version was printed and not updated in 2012. It's just one of the many maps we have on display to show kind of the synthesis of where we are now from where we started. The MPO became the CRTPO when Iredell County joined the group, and I guess they didn't feel there was enough letters in the name. So just a quick rundown of the MPO, CRTPO formal project funding efforts and how they've kind of started. So officially back in 2009 with P 1.0, and P stands for prioritization, it was given a spot ID number, and spot refers to Strategic Prioritization Office of Transportation, just for future reference. So then, following that, in 2009, the MPO approved planning funds to study alignment routes. In 2010, that was adopted by the state 2035 Long Range Transportation Plan, or LRTP, just to continue with the acronyms. This then carried over naturally into P2 and P3, just future prioritizations of the same concept. Those were in 2011 and 2014. They had a new spot ID, and it was now officially being called the NC-75 bypass. That scope included the entire loop concept. And all these efforts to that date didn't rate any scoring threshold to really move up the funding ladder at that point. So there's just a copy of how it looked on the prioritization list. And again, it just didn't qualify anywhere on the radar for funding. Again, in 2009, when they engaged Kimley Horn and Associates to complete the tabletop thoroughfare plan, this was a planning level what if taking previous concept efforts and overlaying them onto existing conditions to inform more deliberate decision-making. This contemplated known environmental and developed property impacts at that time. So in early 2016, when the P4.0 process initiated, based on the current version of the project, to focus prioritization on the eastern quadrant of the North Carolina 75 bypass. This way it increased its funding potential and acknowledged this portion is strategically more critical than the whole concept loop. So this is just the portion from 16 going to 75 in the northeast direction. And this submittal to the CRTPO was formally adopted by the town board in March 2016 in accordance with their CRTPO guidelines. It again had a new spot ID because it specified just the one quadrant of the entire loop of the Parkway project. And again, they used the planning document here as the basis for the submittal. And that's just what it read on their table of projects. And again, it still did not score high enough. It was the lowest rank in the regional tier and did not qualify, again, for any CRTPO point assignments. Those points are what really help define whether it gets funding or not. So here is hard to see, but basically that's Waxhaw Parkway, bottom of the list, bottom score in the initial calculation, and so again, no points for that project. So now as we talk about transitioning to the draft P5.0, which is where we're in now, and that's the 2020 to 2029 funding cycle, the project now ranks 21 out of 25 on the list of NCDOT division needs. It has been recommended now for the allocation of local input points by NCDOT Division 10 and the CRTPO. And this is a competitive, data-driven process, and there's no guarantee the allocation of these points is still going to allow the project to be funded during this time. So at this point, of all the history leading up to this, and now we're kind of on this threshold where we can conclude at this point that funding is likely anticipated maybe as early as 2025 only. This is at the point, once funding is realized, where we really begin the design, the environmental reviews, and the property impact engagement. Right now, we're just going through the process of following the funding guidelines in order to get to that point. So again, this is not an actual project until it is funded, and all efforts right now to date are toward that goal. Any considerations of the impacts to be made are really speculative, and again, attempts at levity aside, I do understand it's an emotional issue in the public's mind on both sides, and I hope these conversations can stay rooted in the facts of the time. The town is keen to stay transparent in the process and provide regular updates throughout the CRTPO process. And at this time, again, it's just too early to contemplate the details to engage in informed discussion of the alignment. But to that end, we value your input. We're going to get your input now and going forward as many opportunities as we can through the website, through your local officials. And so at this point, I'm kind of finished with the history of it, and we can take maybe five minutes if some questions, Alan, certainly, and then we'll roll over to Neil.
Hey, Ben, thanks. And I'm going to start out with a statement, and then it's going to turn into a question.
Okay.
Okay. And here the statement is, we need the park. Okay. So I totally agree. We need the park. We need that northeast section. But I just want everybody to understand that blue line in that northeast section goes right through my farm, through my house, through several of my neighbors' homes. And I just want y'all to understand that up until '09, there were several alignments that were closer to Waxhaw, did not touch any homes. So that one actually touches a bunch of homes and damages homes. So I totally want that parkway. And my question is, because now because it's on there, now that that line is on the map, I'm sitting with a liability, and I'm hurting until everybody, CRTPO, NCDOT, figures out what the line is. So my question to you is, when are we going to figure this out? Because you've got a number of neighbors that are sitting here with a hypothetical line through their property. So we just need a time frame. We need urgency. We want to get it done. I want to get it done.
Right.
And I even will willingly put it on part of my farm, but not through my house and my tree house and split my farm down.
Right.
And there is a perfect place for that. So I'm just saying, when can we move this forward?
Right.
That's the question.
And you know, in the short term, the answer is not going to help you, I don't think, because of the windows we're looking at. If we're saying it's going to be funded in 2025, that doesn't give you any kind of solution to your question, right? To that end, I think we would all like to have it as quick as possible. I don't think CRTPO, NCDOT want to wait that long for when 16 gets down here and stops to then start to get into planning something that, with all the environmental considerations to be made, could take another 5 or 10 years on top of that. Yeah.
I want others to have knowledge. So again, there were multiple alignments before 09, 010. I bought in 09. So when I bought in 09, I had a deed that actually showed it off, not on my property. It said that the alignment's probably going to be down here. And there was the Waxhaw Engineering Department even put one that showed it off of my farm. Suddenly in 09, and then in 16, we get this blue line, you know, and it literally is the worst line of all the alignments I've seen from a homeowner standpoint. Again, the homeowners say, and I'm not going to speak for them, they can speak for them, a lot of them are here tonight. They could say, you know, we're good with the parkway, but please, and don't leave us in this limbo for 5, 6 years. That just is hurting people. And I know engineers have to build roads, but don't hurt people in the process is what I'm asking you, because we're behind you. We want to work with you.
Sure. And you know, there's a couple points in there. One of them is a lot of the other alignments that didn't necessarily go through any property at the time, they weren't buildable alignments. They were up there to show. Well, in terms of a design of a roadway that's supposed to function at the design speeds that DOT needs it to work at. And so that's why everything worked off Kimley Horn's study to kind of overlay that into the conditions at the time. Again, if those homes weren't there when that was done, and that was an alignment that had more input behind it from a design standpoint than any previous one, that's kind of, I guess, the issue of the day. Certainly, other lines can be drawn, but that doesn't necessarily speed up the process. It slows down the process. And then that's the conundrum. It's like, we know we've got to go through this and get the money before we can really, in earnest, talk about what are the real impacts. Now, in terms of what are the felt impacts that you guys are having to deal with because of where this line is and your comfort level with it being, you know, involving your real property, I can understand that. I don't know that I really have a great answer to assuage your fears.
Well, and I'm going to contest your answer that it wasn't built to the NCDOT standards, because there is a route that I feel is very built.
Yeah, that's not to say there's not another route, but the routes that were on other maps that didn't necessarily, you know, impact your property at the time were not necessarily routes that were as well thought out as Kimley Horns. That's why that one was brought forward, because it had the most data behind it.
Okay, well, and again, I'm going to make one more statement and I'll shut up, okay? Because I want other people. That blue line there, you know what that blue line gets to? It gets to the 1,200-acre picture property on 75. The other ones didn't. That one does. It goes directly to. That's zoned high-density commercial residential. So 1,200 acres of high-density. I don't know if there's a representative now owned by Lennar Homes. If there's a representative from Lennar, I'm just begging him. I hope that there's no influence that's causing that
Absolutely, absolutely. I feel sure the people in this room here to try and get this done are not necessarily aware of any link. You know, it is.
I'm going to take one thing off the table. I can assure you there is absolutely no influence whatsoever from Lennar on the town of Middle Springs, on the town of Waxhaw, and on Union County. That is off the table.
And in the future, they won't.
There is no influence. This is about building a road for the region and whatever the best solution is. And to be honest, I wish you would take what your comments and put it in written form and say, get on with it. Flood the CRTPO with comments. Flood it with comments, because that's what's going to drive Neil and team to, and I think you'll support that. That's what will help the most.
And I want to go to your point, and that's what we want. We're saying, what I'm asking people to do is to support it. And support it with the right.
And get on with making that decision.
Yes.
Push us. Push them.
I'm Rick Becker, Town of Middle Springs. I just wanted to, it's sort of a follow-up on Mr. Gardner's question, but I've followed this for a long time.
Right.
And I'm just curious, because I'm not that involved in how these transportation projects are designed. Thank you. But we talk about the routes that were on the maps, like Waxhaw, Weddington, Marvin, Wesley Chapel commissioned their own local area regional transportation plan in 2009. Of course, they showed this parkway. They showed it with an alignment substantially east. The early west, close to Waxhaw. The earlier CRTPO alignments were substantially closer. And out of the blue, so my question is there any record in the RFQ or in the paperwork, or is there anybody from Kimley Horn who worked on the project at that time? Why, out of the blue, did Kimley Horn only do a study on this one alignment, and where did all the other alignments that had been on the map up to date go when Kimley Horn started this study?
Well, I mean, out of the blue is kind of subjective. Again, it was, commissioned through the MPO, the CRTPO, and so it followed whatever guidelines they have and probably still currently have. It's not really an argument about what line or anything. They had good reason to do what they did at the time, and that was a good enough reason to us to bring it forward, because again, we understand environmental processes, the impact processes are going to have to happen in earnest when the real design is funded. That's a fact that's going to have to be done. It's federal money. So those details are going to come to light and be talked about in a better environment. This is really not supposed to be a discussion about one line versus another line. This is about how do we get this thing funded so that we can move it forward before it's 30 years down the road and we've still got the issues with 16 stopping at 75.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm all for that. I think all of us in the region are all for that. I just, I'm curious, what the criteria were, and that's never really been brought out. All I've ever seen of the Kimley Horn work is the cover sheet, the 13 detail sheets, and I'm not seeing a list of criteria that led toward selecting.
And we can certainly provide that for you at a later date. I can follow up with you and get Stuart and everybody else to kind of fill in those blanks. Kimley Horn, they are still available to kind of respond to those.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it, man.
Sure.
Was there an environmental impact statement done?
No, again, it was a tabletop. They just took the latest aerial photo at the time, kind of laid the design parameters on top of it, and again, at that time there were different realities on the ground that led to that alignment. They've clearly changed between then and now, and 2016 when we put it back on the planning. But again, we would have lost time and spent a lot of money that nobody had to try and redo it and still end up at the same place.
Wait, the new line was only done and decided on in 2016, correct?
That's when it was formally adopted in order to get it back on the CRT's planning radar, right?
So you say there was a lot that's happened. So
right, between 2009 and 2016, clearly those areas that didn't have homes on them now do.
No, they were all there, all but one.
You think? Okay.
In 09, there were all but one home. And the one home was built in 27.
would like to know if Neil and Stuart would be willing to look at a more sensible route.
Yeah, I mean, again, it gets into the process that as it's laid out for us. That will stop everything. It has the money for that has to come from somewhere. So if it's not the CRTPO, it has to come from a local level. And I don't know that anybody is really contemplating that. Again, the time it would take to almost start from scratch in the planning side before we get into the design and the real construction side.
Who asked them to change the line? How did that come about? If the line was there before, who or what decided them to move the line? I mean, someone had to say, hey,
Just the planning study. Again, these other lines, it started for the intent of saying we at least have to connect from here to here.
but what
they
was
were
wrong with
based
the
on-
first line? There had to be a reason. What was wrong with the
From
first
my
line?
understanding, there's just not enough information to say that's a good line or not. So when you take that line and then you apply it to the actual conditions, then that created a new line. Does that make sense?
No.
No.
Doesn't, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, before you start, you'll have to spend money on environmental, right?
Yes.
On any route.
Right.
Right. So before you start spending money on this route, what do we need to do? How much will it cost to look at another route? Have any clue?
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly speculate on that.
How much did this one cost?
This one, well, in 2009,
Yes.
I have no idea. Right. But again, that was money that was funded by CRTPO in a planning document. There is no planning funds available right now. So to contemplate it, it can't come through this process. And it can be another conversation, obviously, but for here tonight, what we're trying to establish is how we got here and where do we want to go. And it's clear it doesn't want to go in that direction, but if we want the funding, which really opens the floodgates to really answering the actual questions, not the historical questions.
So you want the funding, but can the funding be then used for another route? Does it have to be for this
Well, the
route?
funding by definition is going to create another route because that's when they do the impact on the ground and when they take into account the houses. All of
They
that.
actually do walk the ground?
Yeah, they'll survey it. Yeah, they'll have to do. It's a very tedious and time-consuming and costly process, and it's much more involved than what has gone previously.
So why didn't we do that to begin with and just
Because it
looking at
costs a
area?
lot of money. It costs a lot more money than that did. That nobody left the office.
But you understand that it costs us personally hundreds of thousands of dollars because that line was put on a map? You're saying it costs
I'm
you
going to intercede here because Matt's been here about a year. I can't answer all these questions, and it puts him in a difficult spot. And at the time that they built that, there was a lot of variables. The only one around that should be able to answer it. I can answer some. The reality is, what we're trying to get is scored to get funding so we can determine what is a sensible route from all factors. That's what's really at play here. Thus, your comments help them, but that's really what's at play to get to the most sensible route here. They will look at the route. They will look at the environmental. They will evaluate it from today's point of view. Not from
next year, not 5, 6, 7.
The first
8
step we
years.
have to do is get it scored, and because if it doesn't get approved, then they're not going to be looking at it. They got millions upon millions of other projects to look at. That's the challenge. That's why we work together to try to let's get it scored so we can get a sensible route.
I don't want to monopolize it with Greg, but I actually have a good question along those lines, Steve, if that is appropriate. We're doing comments, CRTPO solicits comments, which go into the scoring process somehow. Do those comments become a permanent part of the project file? So in other words, when I'm asking, I'm not trying to put you on the spot because you can't read the mind of the spot office and so forth, but if there are 100 comments or 200 comments saying, yeah, we love the Parkway, we live in Waxhaw, or we live in Mineral Springs, and we're stuck in traffic every afternoon. We want that to happen, but if you fund this in 2025, that route is horrible and we endorse a different route study, will that have a little bit of weight? Will that be in the file 5 years from now? It won't get lost.
Correct. And as you're aware, the first step, obviously, is to bring all of these comments at the end of the public comment period before the CRTPO board, which is comprised of elected officials throughout the three-county region. They make their final call on the assignment of these local points based upon the comments received. And to that right, the CRTPO board has the right to divert from the recommended local point methodology. So right now, my organization has 80 points on this project, and Division 10 has 100 points on this. That improves the score, and I'm going to get into that in a few minutes here. But again, if we get a flood of comments, like what we did last time with the rail issue, that'll prompt our elected officials to say, hey, is there another solution? Can we do something else with this? Can we not put points on it this time? But what we're trying to do here, and I think Matt has articulated that, is in 2010, we did a planning level study. Our federal funds can't be used for design. You actually have to have right-of-way committed. You have to do a certain level of design to be able to understand what those real environmental impacts are to be able to move the alignment, and we just have not had those resources yet. And CRTPO they can't use their planning level resources to complete a design. So we're kind of at a rock and a hard place. This county is growing very rapidly. We all know we need this type of regional solution. And if this project is to get funding, and that is not a done deal, my organization nor Division 10 has that authority. If it gets funding, that's only the beginning of it there. Basically they will go back at using the alignment, the most recent alignment as a base, but they'll develop several different alternatives, and they will not choose an alternative that would negatively impact the natural or the built environment.
Yeah, I'm a real estate broker, and I can tell you that while I think this plan is, we need the parkway, obviously, I understand that what you're saying is we have to put up with this plan until it's funded, and then they'll do the surveys, and then they'll decide where the real line is. But the impact today in real dollars is really hard for the people who are in that blue line. And I know that personally because I've shown property in there. My buyers walked away. They loved the property. They said, we're afraid. And I talked to people here in Waxhaw. I might even have talked to you, Matt. Probably did. Yeah. And then I talked to the people over in Raleigh as well. And so I understand that it's not funded, but you still, you cannot work with uncertainty today, and that it's impacting everybody who lives over there. So I understand what we're saying. So what I would like to take away from this meeting tonight is an address list. Who should we write to? What should we say? Should we have a petition? What gives us the most clout so we can say, yes, proceed with the parkway, yes, let us know where it's going to be as soon as possible. I think that's what we all want, right?
Ma'am, my organization, CRTPO, is currently seeking comments on whether or not it is a good idea to put our local priority points or our local input points on this project. So if everyone here wants to make a difference and not have that project considered for local points, you need to submit comments to us at crtpo.org saying you do not want CRTPO to put 80 points on this project.
But to her point, I think we want you to put
But we want you to.
Okay?
Here's what we want. You say we got to get funded in 5, 10 years, and what she's saying is we're dead in the water until you do something.
Mm-hmm.
Can't you have planning funds just like you did that blue line? Because there are alternatives that help everybody. Through rural land, doesn't even hit our houses. It goes through part of my farm. I'm okay with that because it doesn't ruin my house. Can't the CRTPO or the town of Waxhaw put in planning funds just like you did on this desktop here?
So let me be clear.
Yeah.
Conservatively, somewhere about $500,000. And it's not the town of Waxhaw, and it's not CRTPO. It would be 40% Waxhaw, somewhere in the 35. I don't know how much yours is and how much the county is, because the Waxhaw Parkway is not a town of Waxhaw Road. It's about 35 to 40% within our city limits. I don't know how much is in yours and how much is the county. I think just his phone. So we would have to find those funds locally to do it. And if that,
Can we kick in?
huh?
Can we kick in?
I don't know that we have
Because it's costing me $300,000, $400,000 So I'm gonna kick in money until you have it done.
Great, I'll
It goes to the campaign contribution.
the point is, if you provide that comment to them, then we can lay out that plan of attack. But he's he's right. If we want to fund it locally, we're going to have to come up with the money locally to do it. That's just the nature of the beast.
My name is Bjorn Hansen. I work for the county as a transportation planner, and if this were called the Union County Parkway, I'd probably be hosting this meeting and catching the comments. The Union County Board of Commissioners next Monday night will be deciding whether to amend its development regulations called the UDO, the Unified Development Ordinance, to take away the current language in our development regulations that stipulate that roads that are on the Comprehensive Transportation Plan, which is the big picture plan that's over there, it used to be called the Thoroughfare Plan, so that any development would have to dedicate the right-of-way for that project, so that Mr. Gardner or anyone else, if they wanted to develop their property, would have to dedicate the right-of-way for that. The state law, or the case law in North Carolina, has radically changed in the last decade to make it more protective of property owners, and rightfully so. You had a lot of people who, when bypasses were proposed, they were kind of locked in place for a long time. They weren't compensated until the land was actually a part of a funded project. And that was what the county did as well, because that's what the state law let us do. And we protected right-of-way for future roads. If the county commission chooses to go with what the county planning board approved almost 12 months ago, to take those protections away, Mr. Gardner or anyone else could develop in the path of this project. We would advise them. We'd say, hey, we have this bypass in the way that we have identified in this area. Could we work with you and reserve the land, or maybe build a portion as a part of your development? And he could tell us to go away. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And if you try and stop me, I'm going to sue you. And our county attorneys have told us, yep, they can and they'll win. So our staff have recommended to take that provision out of our Unified Development Ordinance. That means that he could develop his property however he wanted without any reference to this parkway. And we would then, with the town of Waxhaw, with the town of Mineral Springs, with the NCDOT, figure out how to work around it in 10, 15 years, 5 years, whenever the road is funded and we have to design and build it. It's going to be a lot more difficult because you really try and avoid homes. You're trying to avoid human impacts, environmental impacts, noise impacts, et cetera, et cetera. You try and choose the best alternative, but it's a trade-off. And so that's what the county's doing. We are not, as of right now, today, we're acting to protect that corridor if a development were to cross our desk. In a week, we're probably no longer going to protect that corridor. So the idea of the properties being harmed, it's not going to be there in a week in all likelihood. And that's from the county perspective. As it relates to actually protecting this corridor, if it were designed, the county is not in the condemnation of land business for roads. We barely do it for sewer, which is what they are in the business of doing. And so we would never protect this right-of-way except when it became a funded project. So therefore, the county's not going to participate in designing this project, spend hundreds of thousands, potentially $1 million to design this project so that it's a no-kidding set alignment, and then have it be torn apart the minute someone wants to put a home, business, some other type of improvement in its corridor. And so that's a situation as it relates to right-of-way protection, land development, the portion that is in the county, and the county's commitment to putting money into actually putting a study together or protecting the land for when it actually is able to get built.
If the county works with that landowner and they want to move that right away, do they consider the design at that time? So if they want to develop that property and set some land apart, would they do the expensive design of that area?
It's always situation dependent, because if he wants it and it's perfect, great, we put it right there. If it's off a little bit and then it ripples through to the adjacent property owners, we have to think about how that works with them, because we're potentially changing their land developability, possibly for the better, possibly worse. It may affect the cost of the project, because maybe now all of a sudden the alignment switches a little bit. You need a bridge over a creek, whereas before you didn't. So I really can't say. Sometimes you do, sometimes you can't.
So those landowners could group together and have land that they are willing to give up. So when that project does come, it sort of forces the county to use that, the state to use that.
Again, that's kind of putting the cart before the horse, because there are so many considerations for the design of the project that it may work for them to do that, but then where the land isn't theirs to control, there may be such impacts that you can't use that corridor.
So, my question is, that's a proposed line. And at another meeting, I asked what the certainty was of that line being there, and again, nobody could give me a certainty. My big question is, why does a line have to be on the map to begin with? We know there's going to be a bypass, and I don't know, and talking about what Alan's brought up, this lake here, it's impacting properties. With that line to be on there, that projected line, that could just potentially or possibly be another route. And if we know there's a route going in somewhere, why can't you guys do your study, and then we can get close to where it's more than likely going to be, then put it on the map, and then the people that are going to be impacted will have a greater certainty that they are truly going to be impacted. Right now, that line can be moved, and these folks that have suffered property, and this lady here can't sell property because that line there, that's very unfair.
That's not unfair to me, it's just unfair to
That's the reason why the county, and I can't speak for either of the municipalities, why the county is taking away that restriction upon the property. So it's something to take into consideration when you develop your land, but we are not going to stop it.
What's the reason for the line being there?
It's to identify a need.
Sir?
It's to identify a need. It's just a starting place. It's to say,
You mean we have to have a projected road on the map just to define a need?
it's to respond to an identified need.
Well, we all agree there's a need, but we don't need a line on the map.
Actually, we do. We do have to have a line on the map.
And I'll just speak from CRTPO's perspective. There's a state law in North Carolina that every metropolitan planning organization has to have an adopted comprehensive transportation plan. And one of those primary reasons why is to identify the need, to really understand where our facilities need improvement or where we need a recommended facility. And from there, that drives the process of developing a lot of our other plans that actually involve funding. But we need to have that line on the map to demonstrate the need. Our board needs to take action to adopt that. And along those same lines, NCDOT's board also adopts that plan. It's a mutually adopted plan between the state and CRTPO, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization. And that is a state law that we have a plan like that.
Is there a law that says that someone like Kinley Horn has to say this is the way?
No, but in order for us to modify the alignments within the CTP, we need to have something. We need to have a planning level exercise, similar to what was done for the Waxhaw Parkway back in 2010. So we can't just arbitrarily shift the alignment without a professional engineer taking a look at it.
Okay, the professional engineer took a look on an aerial map, correct?
Yes, and now I was not with CRTPO when that happened, but
That's
yes.
I understand. Matt just said it. Why not look at the aerial map again and draw a new line?
Because we need resources to do that. We need to hire a consultant, and we had.
Any of us could do that on Google Earth. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude. I just,
It's amazing how it
we
hurts.
live in a magical place there on Cerritos Farm. I can't tell you what a beautiful thing it's been for this community. Sorry. We had no idea when we built a treehouse for our daughter that the little more our world would open up. People call and say, I want to see it. Well, okay, sure, come on and see it. We have let thousands of people come and visit and pet baby goats and brush miniature donkeys and feed the baby goats. And I know that's not a big deal, but it is to those children and those families and those grandparents. I just feel so close to this community because of this thing that we did. And it will take out the treehouse. It will cut our farm in half. And I just want to know, do we have to say no to the parkway to save our farm?
Well, one thing I'll tell you is that we develop our transportation improvement program every 2 years. So if there's something that is not right about the scope of this project at this time, we will do the same exercise again in 2020. So within those 2 years, there's the opportunity to reevaluate that. But what I'm trying to say is there's limited resources within CRTPO. We used to have discretionary planning funds that we could use for this. We're a bigger organization now. We have a lot of other plans and things that we need to undertake at the federal level. So that's limiting our ability to take on a lot of these alignment studies.
I have a question. How much money was spent to do this chemical alarm back in, when was that done, 2009? What was the cost to do that?
The problem's gonna be that once you do start that survey process, you're gonna start committing funds to that project. And then when it runs down and it resembles that line, there's gonna be nowhere else to go. So as she asked, we just say no now, or they don't have any assurances, and that's what they're looking for.
And that's one thing I would encourage you all to do tonight is put your concerns into, type them up, send them into my organization, and we will include those when we take this list for adoption to our CRTPO board. That's really the process of how we move this forward.
So that's in essence what you're saying. If we put this all on paper and we send it to you, and you send it before, we're not gonna invest these 80 points into the phone. So you're basically saying, it's either gonna go this way, because I can just about guarantee that, once you start that survey, it's gonna pretty much resemble that line. And it's gonna go against what everybody here wants. So, the question goes back to, right now, if you don't want it, or if it's your TPO, give us any kind of assurance, because if not, I'm pretty sure that's what they're gonna write.
This is a process that we undertake every 2 years. So if there's, again, I've said this before, if there's an issue, we don't have to put our points on it now. We can reevaluate this in 2020. But between now and then, someone needs to get resources together to reevaluate this, do another alignment study.
But it won't be CRTPO, it'll fall on Lewis.
We have relatively limited resources. We can't commit to that at this time. Yes, sir.
My name is John Hayes. I'm the neighborhood gardener. This is my property tax A couple of questions. Is there a representative from Lanier here tonight? There's not. Okay. Is anybody from Lanier's tie-in line for developing that property when they plan to start developing? We have a conversation happening. Does anybody know if Lanier has spent any money on developing, surveying as to where they need to have roads built to accommodate their development? Not as far as the town of Waxhaw. Do you have a contact name or number, somebody from here that you can talk to, find out where they are in that process?
Basically, they come to us, we don't come to them actively seeking anything. So if there's something formal they want to ask for permission to do on that site, that's where it starts.
Relating to the development as to how you determine road needs for different areas. And you're surveying these roads out, you're putting them out there, and where the road needs to be because of a bridge or a creek or topographically how land lays. Okay, there's got to be a need for Lanier for what they're doing and the density that they're putting in. They have to have roads somewhere that falls on the lay of the land that they own.
Right.
How does that impact where this road needs to be?
Right now, it doesn't. How the conversation naturally starts is they would come in with a plan. If that plan doesn't have a by right and they're in a conditional use area, I believe, they have to provide all of it. We'll have a transportation impact analysis required on them so that they show what the implications are of there. So whether it's phased so small that they can't really do all of it at once until they wait for this, or there's some other means where they bring all the money to the table to solve the mitigation costs, that's the formal
Well,
process.
I guess what I'm driving at, the road comes down across the 75, and the other road kind of just meandering down through their land. Okay? So we're all here because it impacts our property, but I find it interesting that nobody's here from Lanier to say, hey, it's going for our property at this point. They don't have a question or an impact or a concern as to where this thing is going. I mean, at some point, they would come to you with a layout of a plan and say, here's what we'd like to do. How does this, and I understand there needs to be one version between government, highways,
saying, well, gee, there's no impact as to what Lanier wants to do on where these roads go, that's really not a truly factual statement. Because that's a big development, and they need to have infrastructure to accommodate all those houses and all that development that they're putting in there, correct? So at what point does Lanier come to you guys and say, hey, here's what we need, here's what we want to do? There's got to be some point in planning all this stuff that says, gee, we got to put this road in, we got to accommodate the traffic that's coming out of this development.
And I guess to your question, the point is when they have an answer to that themselves. Because we don't have it.
They're going to county, Union County, and they're fighting next week. They want, so the county doesn't protect the land, they can care less about it. They want that rule to go through, so they can develop that property any way they want, and we as taxpayers have to pay for it.
That's Waxhaw.
That's Union County.
No, the near property is Waxhaw.
Oh, it's in the city of Waxhaw?
Yeah, they annexed it into Waxhaw. It was Union County.
So how long till Union County's law ends up here in Waxhaw? Can't be far behind.
I mean, back to the question, it's $40 million for this section of the bypass. So whoever comes up with that money first, how much? $30 to $40 million.
34 million from 16 down to 75.
16 to 75, right. You got to cross the railroad, that's a bridge crossing. And so that's my speculation why they haven't come to us about anything, because we don't have that money to do it. So we can't answer them.
But if that right-of-way that you were talking about is voted away, they take that away, would they take it away from these people that have the homes? You said go, I think I understood next week, vote against what they're trying to do is to get rid of that right-of-way? Am I misunderstanding?
Well, all the county commission is looking to do is to take it out of their out of our development regulations for future development. So if you were to come and want to develop your property and this were affecting it, you could ignore it, essentially. You wouldn't have to reserve that right of way.
Let me make a point to that. People aren't ignoring it in our neighborhood. You know what they're doing? They're putting off having improvements to their land because they see that blue line.
So can I ask that though? Because, I own the property that's on the red line. Sorry, can you move, sir? I own the property that's on the red line, right? So I'm not building my house right now because of that red line now. But now the rules are changing. I can build my house in a week, and then this whole thing is going to be screwed because I built my house in the middle of the red line.
What Neil and Matt have been trying to convey about these lines is that until it's a funded project and it's designed, and then right on the heels of that design, money is spent on right-of-way acquisition, you aren't really accomplishing very much because, one, the rules may change. Environmental regulations change, the calculus of what the floodplain is. We had a hurricane come through. I have the floodplain maps changed because of that? Yeah? Well, that's going to affect where you want to put the road. Because if you have to cross a floodplain, now you're talking about structures. As much as possible, you don't want to have to build those unless you have to. So you design it under the rules that are in place at that time. If we're to design it in 2018 and the road doesn't get built until 2028, big difference. And we aren't going to spend money to buy out their land. We're not. And so therefore, for 10 years, they can do whatever they want because we're not going to stop them. Then all of a sudden, if we designed this nice road and then 10 years later there's a half a dozen houses in the way, well, guess what? We're redesigning the road. So none of these lines are sacrosanct. They're the best we're doing with the resources we have available. They give us a starting point for the actual studies, but the only way you get to the real studies is to have a funded project.
Sir, if you fellows' house were on this line, or maybe the bill on this line, would be making the same statement.
I would consult a realtor and know about the map.
What's that mean?
I would consult a realtor who's obligated to tell me about these plans, and I'd make a decision off of that.
What if the realtor can't tell the bill rate?
It's the realtor's obligation to do so.
Yeah, we are obligated by law.
That was a counter that I bought the property a year and a half ago, and it was never disclosed.
Should have been.
But it actually didn't happen.
Well, I bought in '09, it wasn't on my property, and then it was moved over my property.
These guys can't handle that stuff. They can only handle the topics they're skilled in. we can't get into the legal debate on that.
Hey, Stuart, you're up there. What can the NCDOT do when it's, I mean, you look at that blue line. That blue line, say it comes to you, because don't you ultimately do the study to find the final?
We do. Once it's a funded project, we do the environmental planning process, which will examine not only this alignment.
Can you speak into the microphone?
Sure.
Because we are taping this.
Sorry about that. Once this becomes a funded project, we will begin, one of the first things that we do is initiate the environmental planning process. That process will look at not only this line on the map, but any other alternative lines that we develop that make sense from a topographical standpoint, from a standpoint of impacts to streams, wetlands, swim buffers. And it's not only, as Neil mentioned earlier, not only the natural environment, but the human environment as well. So what you're trying to do there is find the best fit alignment that strikes a balance between a lesser number of impacts to the natural environment, as well as protecting homes and properties. So that's what we're ultimately trying to get to. Now, the line that you see on the map here was developed around 2009-2010 timeframe. I've heard the question several times this evening, why did this push so much further east? When you look at this, you see all of the impacts here to streams, wetlands areas, those types of things. There wasn't a really good way to thread that through there, looking at the topography that exists there, and still avoid or minimize the impacts to those streams and floodplains. So that's why the alignment was pushed further east. That doesn't mean that that is where it's going to be built ultimately. Again, that's a process that we will be going through to find a suitable alignment that both meets the needs of the transportation network and respects the homes and property of those in the community.
Back on the cost thing, you have about $30–40 million right there. So if the year comes in and says, we're going to donate the land, we're going to build the road, we need to have the road here to accommodate our road, pick up all that expense, position of where they come into on NC 75, is it going to impact where you guys want to come and meet that? When they come up and say, gee, we're donating all this infrastructure right away, land, we're paying for it, we're going to put it in because we need it. All we need from you guys is to make the other end of the road tee up where we want to be.
I think that's probably if that were to happen, we would look at their connection points to 75 and see how viable that connection point is for options and different alignments coming from the northeast quarter of the Parkway. I don't think we can get down to that level with any degree of certainty, from an engineering standpoint. Again, until we have a funded project, we don't have the resources to undertake an in-depth study that will satisfy both the NCDOT, the environmental resource agencies, and all the other agencies involved that it needs to satisfy. That's right. That's correct.
So at some point you want to have a viable intersection.
That's right.
With what you're trying to do and what they're trying to do.
And that's one of the reasons that, again, you see that road going a little further east, because if it had been pulled back to the west, what you're effectively looking at is a tunnel going under the railroad property, where by pushing it further east, you're actually going under an existing bridge out there. And that could be utilized to... Yes, sir.
That's what Leon has. They have a tunnel.
College Road, where College Road comes in, is that crossing of College Road and then close down and the road turn and come into Waxhaw Plantation and tie into the blue line? Is that how you handle College Road traffic? Do you know that?
I'll refer that question to Brian Gackstetter with the Rail Division. I will preface that by saying this is a very high-level process that we're working with right now, and it doesn't get down to that level of detail to determine how roads will be connected. Again, those are the types of things that would be studied once you have a funded project.
Follow up on his question with Lennar Homes developer. I understand that you're not in contact or working together or anything at all, and that after the funding is approved, then
If they chose to develop that property once we have a funded project, yes, sir.
I'm Scott Colin with the North Carolina Department of Transportation. I'd like to add to that you know, this environmental process is very much a transparent and a public process. It is not something that we go into a back room with a developer and say, oh, you're going to put your road here, we're going to put our road there, and they're just going to meet up magically. That's not the way it works. We go through a very transparent environmental process where we go through this land and we look at everything from threatened and endangered species to wetlands to stream crossings to archaeological, historic properties, quite a wide array of natural and human environment impacts. And then we come to terms on what we see as a recommended alignment. You know, I'll say this line on the map is very much a representation of how to get from 16 to 75. Okay, it was a best guess idea at the time when the study was done. As we go through this environmental process, basically the line on the map just represents point A to point B, and we look at all alternatives to try to get there with minimal impacts to the environment, to our citizens, and to the things that we care about as society, and we engage in that in a very public process. That's what I understand. We are going to look at all impacts. Impacts to your farm, impacts to possible threatened and endangered species, right? And we're going to, together, we're going to choose the best alignment. That's what we... It's not within this watershed, as I understand it. Yeah. Right. 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 So basically, what we're saying, this line is just a starting point, a representation of connecting 2 points, and we are going to evaluate all alternatives. We have to. I mean, that is the process that we have to follow. The state, the SEPA, and the NEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, means that we go into this process without a predetermined concept, without a predetermined alignment. Okay, this is a line on a map. It is a representation. Just to say, you know, why do we have a line on the map? Because we're showing that we're connecting these 2 points. You know, could we move the line? Well, we might move the line, but then guess what? It's on somebody else's property, and we got a different room full of people here that are impacted by that alignment. So no. Right. It doesn't matter what this line, where it is.
It does matter.
I understand. I'm just saying that when we engage in a funded project and in the process to determine the final alignment, this line makes no difference to us.
I heard Dennis Rory say to when you guys were voting, when the Waxhaw Council was voting on it, what do you want, this one or this one? I heard him say it.
It was in the video of the BOC meeting.
So can we have the old one? And we'll impact a lot fewer people.
Actually, it does better when this line is, because I'm trying to send a property, same neighborhood as Marcus. And people
taking it off the map entirely would be disingenuous to the process. We know a road's going to go from point A to point B. And the old,
Even the old one is arbitrary, so everybody should know that.
yeah,
Doesn't go through arms.
the old one is arbitrary as well. So it,
Arbitrary line impacts people's property. It just does not make any sense. Because that makes no sense at all. If it's an arbitrary line and it's impacting these people as much as it is, and you say, at the end of it, it might be here, it might be there. If your statements don't meet like this, you say the line doesn't matter, but it matters so much for it to just be drawn on a map so you can do a study. I don't know why you can't do a study, pick the best route, and then put the line on the map, because you start zeroing down to where it actually is going to go. You haven't answered it satisfactorily at all.
from our process, that's putting the cart before the horse. Okay, to finalize an alignment would be to predetermine the process.
When they say finalize it, I'm saying study it without a line being on the map. Then when you start zeroing down where the best route will be environmentally and impact, then put the line on the map. Then people would have a better idea that, hey, this is really going to impact me.
The harsh reality is, folks, the line on the map is there because we had to build a comprehensive planning, comprehensive transportation. It is an arbitrary line. It is. I get that it impacts. We can't do anything about the impact from a real estate perspective and property ownership, other than to get this to the next stage to where we understand exactly and minimize the impact, as you and I have talked, put some certainty into the process. The other alternative, sir, is it's real simple. Take it off the map, we don't have a road, and then we'll all just park out here on 16. We have to think in terms of what we were going to do here. No. Just a minute. Just a minute.
Some of my property is impacting.
I understand that, but just a minute. We have to have lines on the map to get the process underway to build a transportation network. This isn't easy. This isn't easy. They've done a line. It is arbitrary at this point in time. By definition, they will study it if it ever comes to fruition as a project. The alternative, we will have a line on the map. The alternative is to not have a transportation plan.
So if you take that line off the map, then the project goes away just like that?
I mean, yeah, they don't have anything to base anything on. Because, it's a process we're going through. We're trying to fix it. Middle of the road, we're trying to fix it.
I do understand that.
Great.
It doesn't help. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help the state.
I understand that.
Unless you put something on the website that if we intend in about 8 years from now to put a highway there, we are proposing a possibility of make people understand what's going on. Now, you look at the map, there's going to be a highway, we're done, let's get out of here. Railroad guys again, are you talking about a viaduct from the top of the railroad or the road going underneath?
Type of crossing would be determined through the environmental process based on grades and things like that. And if the alignment were to shift 2,000 feet, if the alignment were to shift to the west even further, closer to Collins, we could look at it as a closure there and tie that up. If it was pushed further back to the west, then we probably wouldn't close Collins. But that's all evaluated through the environmental process. We don't look at that at this point. Grades determine where the actual alignment comes across the railroad. Will determine how we go, if we go under or we go over. No, because we don't have an alignment. It's just a line on the map. That alignment can shift 2,000 feet one way, can shift 2,000 feet another. It's not set in stone at that particular location. So we just don't know. The railroad prefers to go over. They don't want to maintain railroad bridges. It's much cheaper to maintain a highway bridge than it is a rail bridge. Yes.
So to try and just, again, set the expectations here, this is the beginning of the conversation, just like it's the beginning of the funding efforts. We don't expect. We knew we weren't going to have all the answers to your questions, but we are in the process to find those out for you, to get kind of a win-win out of all of this, from our side, putting the road into your side, having it impact you as least as possible. This is not the first road that's ever been built. It's not going to be the last, but it's the first one to affect this area, and so we're all going to go through this together. We can't continue all night with all the questions, and certainly we don't have great answers for you, so we've got our work cut out for us, and we've got to ask for your patience and kind of trust us to work this out so that everybody understands, and it's not just question after question that just leads to kind of resentment and distrust. We're people, you're people. We're going to come together and make this happen if we're going to be successful, or it's not going to happen, and who knows where we end up.
One more question, if you don't mind. Let's say right on that blue line as it exists right now, if 3 more homes were built right on it, how much would that affect the line on the line?
Yeah, I mean, these are hypotheticals. What's going to have to happen is when the funding does come down and we get into this process, those costs for the right-of-way, whether it's moving a house or going around the house, those costs go up. The longer we take and the longer we negotiate this to try and find a solution that may or may not exist, really, to make it, if we raise it up over everything, nobody gets hurt, but that's not going to happen because of the money. So it's always going to follow the money.
For the ones that want to write CRPTO, what do we say for them to pay attention? What exactly are the words that we should say to get their attention?
Tell them what you feel. I mean, again, tell them where you are.
Don't want it, let me want the part.
Right. Whatever is in your heart and in your mind, lay it out there so that we can then take it into account. So we can respond in a way that maybe it doesn't help, maybe it does help, but we've got to further the process. We've got to try. And I've got to let Brian speak. He was supposed to give his piece on it so you can understand what the real meat of the process is. And so again, we will come back. We will come back to this and address all of this as part of the process. And so if you would give us the patience to that, I would appreciate it.
Folks, I had a presentation that would take 10 to 15 minutes, but I'm not going to go through that. We're at 7:30 right now. I know that you guys probably still want to ask us a few questions. I want to give you a few facts first. So this is one of 25 projects that's competing for funding in Division 10. And there's about $175 million worth of available funding over a 10-year period. This is the 21st highest ranked project in Division 10. So even if CRTPO and Division 10 put its points on it this time, there's absolutely no guarantee that this project even qualifies for funding this time. If it does qualify for funding, it will be in the second 5 years of our 10-year program. So what that means is that there'll be some planning environmental work that'll get done, and we'll have to resubmit this project and put our points on it again. So I want to leave you all with that so that you all understand that we are not the deciders of funding for this. This is not an imminent project, and there are multiple opportunities for you all to help us determine how this alignment should be built. It's not going to be done in a vacuum, and we're just here tonight to promote CRTPO's Division Needs public comment period. Division 10 also has a public comment period. Both of these projects are a part of that, and again, on behalf of CRTPO, I certainly encourage you all to submit your comments. Talk about the need to maybe take another look at the alignment. Talk about the importance of this parkway for the regional mobility. We want to hear all of that, and don't feel like you're limited to 140 characters. Write me a book. I'll read it and I'll summarize it for you all. And I'm willing to stay here and talk with every one of you just to make sure I understand your concerns.
I just want to make a comment to everybody that Neil has been wonderful in this process because I bugged him for the last year. And I've been kind of instigating a lot of comments to him, so I'm sure he's had to read a lot of them. But I did want to answer Bonnie's question and just state what my viewpoint is and what I'm going to say this year. And it's to say that Waxhaw needs this. And we need to get it through this situation. We wait 2 more years, then we got to find the money to get another alignment. But the frustrating thing to me is that nobody wants to just give us a little comfort now And so, literally, he's on that alignment. And so what I'm saying is, I want it through. I want to get it through. I know Waxhaw needs it. But we can't just say, oh, we can't throw up our hands. And we say, well, you know, it's got to go through the process. No, there is a way. There is a way to come up sooner than later with another alignment. That's a win-win. That's a win-win for me.
And part of that, sir, is just getting at what I was talking about. If CRTPO puts its points on it, Division 10 puts its points on this project, it's not going to get funded in the first 5 years. Basically, they're going to have to do some planning and environmental to better understand.
In the first 5 years, they're going to have to do it.
Yes, but they are not acquiring right-of-way. They are not finalizing design. But
General ideas of where they align.
in North Carolina, this is the means to move a new location project forward.
So we'll get in that first 5 years kind of a better idea of where that blue or whatever line's going to go.
Yes.
Is that what I'm hearing, sir?
If it gets funded, but
If it's funded.
Yeah.
If it's funded.
If it makes funding. To talk about the process a little bit, as has been stated several times throughout this evening's presentation, the blue line is essentially just a line on a map. It's a starting point, a point A to point B connection. We have to develop that point A to point B connection to be able to create a rough, high-level cost estimate and work toward getting that project funded. We can't seek funding without some type of cost estimate. The cost estimate comes from the line on the map. So it does create, admittedly, an unfortunate situation with the property owners over whose property that line passes. But in order to be able to advance that project forward, get it funded, get it built eventually, and create a better transportation network within the town of Waxhaw that better serves its residents and provides better mobility and connectivity, this is the process that we have to go through. And again, once the project becomes funded, generally from that point it takes roughly 8 to 12 months to get a firm on board, get them under contract, get them moving. An environmental process for a project of this type, that's generally probably a 24-month process, at which time during that process we would be looking at the multiple alignments and the different alternatives that we've talked about this evening. So that's how we would get to that point once it becomes a funded project. But as I said earlier, we have to get it to a point of being funded first. And unfortunately, that requires putting the line on the map and placing that cloud over some property owner's property.
Okay, Neil, question. So the process, because I know it was in your slides, is so October, we have comment period to October 4th, everybody, to crtpo.org. And then on October 17th, we can present as well at the CRTPO meeting.
That's correct.
In Charlotte.
All you have to do is sign up 5 minutes before the meeting starts, and I believe each speaker has 3 minutes.
Right, 20 minutes, whatever.
Yeah.
And then you're going to go through the process of figuring out if this makes it or not, and we'll know when. January?
Well, it's not me. This is
But the CRTPO.
this is NCDOT in Raleigh does this for the entire state.
After
Now,
we agree to put the points on it.
yeah, exactly. You're correct, Mayor.
So is it January when this thing comes?
Yeah, so the draft 2020 through 2029 STIP throughout the entire state will be released likely in January of 2019. At that point, we will know if this project is in the 10-year plan, where it is in the plan. But for right now, it's based upon the quantitative score that NCDOT has already calculated and whether or not we put points on this project and how it interrelates to the other projects it's competing against within Division 10.
So, work with me. So January, let's say it does make the list.
Mhm.
Then when does the funding, is that funding immediately, the whole funding issue?
No, typically for a project like this, we might be lucky to have preliminary engineering just to determine what the cost estimate is, 2025, 2026, something like that.
When does that environmental thing get done?
So once the draft STIP is released, as Neil indicated in January, before it becomes a formal document, it requires North Carolina Board of Transportation approval, and that would not occur until somewhere around the June 2019 timeframe. If that project were to become funded in that document in June, and this is if, we're not saying that it will, but if it were to become a funded project, then at that point we would begin the process of selecting a firm to do that work, and requesting the funding authorizations to be released to get that firm under contract, begin the environmental planning process, which would help begin the process of determining those alignments.
She's had her hand up like an hour.
Wait a second, I just have a question. You were talking about the environment,
Yes, ma'am.
so all of these green lines, aren't those creeks?
They are.
And remember on the other side of the county where they had a problem with the hill splitter? Is all that gonna be taken into consideration too, that we might have hill splitters over there?
As we understand it, as Mr. Cole mentioned earlier, the hill splitter is not an issue in this area.
Why?
So, as I understand it, and I'm not a biologist, okay, but as I understand it, that threatened and endangered species does not live in a creek in the watershed of this, okay?
I think it does, because we have creeks.
So that will be evaluated when we do the environmental process. All threatened and endangered species will be evaluated, and we have several of them here locally, and that being one of them. Yes.
Is the other side of 75 next to come up that would play a determining factor of how that aligns across 75? You've got it coming from 60 to 75. Is that, do we know if that's the next phase, or would be considered that if that other side wasn't going to come in directly there, it could alter your line also?
Not sure that I can provide an answer to that question. I will say that the reason that the northeast quarter was selected was because a portion of the Waxhaw Parkway was already constructed on the northwest side. So that made it the most desirable quadrant to be able to create a bypass around Waxhaw, because you already had a portion of it built on the northwest side. That made it more desirable than having none of the alignment built around the southwest portion of it.
So when was that decided on, the starting right here, on both sides of 16 right here? When was that decision made?
I don't know that I have the answer to that question. I will say that the alignment was in place mostly over to 16 as it comes around by the post office and around that subdivision, which it runs behind and connects through roughly to Helms Road. There's a stub beside the CVS on 16 that is intended to be the beginning of the parkway on the east side of 16. So at the time in 2009 that alignment study was initiated, one of the reasons that was done is because there was some interest in trying to develop that property in that northeast quarter. And the town wanted to be proactive and get out ahead of that and try to set an alignment such that when that property did develop, they had the ability to protect that alignment. So that's really how it came about. That's right. This would probably be a 4-lane median divided roadway. Again, its intent is to provide an alternate connection both to NC 16 and 75. And the NCDOT does have projects to widen NC 16 from Ray Road down to Waxhaw Parkway. So it would continue that 4-lane median divided roadway on over to 75 and create that bypass around the core part of the downtown.
The state does this. They don't like federal highways and stuff. If there's existing structures or content that avoid barriers,
it will depend on the funding and the type of environmental document that's required. Different funding documents have different requirements, as well as different funding sources have different requirements. Some of those funding sources and environmental documents require an analysis for noise wall. Some of them do not. Yeah, we will not know that until the project is funded and we know what kind of environmental document that we're doing, as well as what the funding source is. There could or could not be. I can't answer that question fairly at this time. Sir? No, it depends on the type of funding source and environmental document as to whether or not an evaluation is required at all.